So, Catherine, thank you very much for coming. In a previous life, Catherine was a factual programme maker with the BBC, and at the moment she's a lecturer in sociology and a member of Glasgow University Media Group, researching audience reception and social change, particularly focusing on media coverage in climate change and sustainability, and the potential for behaviour change. In 2015, she collaborated with Chatham House on a major international study looking at the potential role of the public in reducing greenhouse gas emissions through dietary behaviours. Catherine has given evidence at the House of Commons Select Committee on Climate Policy and Public Understanding, presented to the Scottish Government, and at national and international conferences, and she's appeared on the BBC and Al Jazeera. So thank you for coming from Glasgow to be with us, and you have your 20 minutes.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for having me, and a sociologist of all things, the enemy, so it's really, really nice to be here. And it's really, really nice to be asked to speak about this question, indeed this problem, which I've been exploring for the last 6 years, which is not the practical problem of climate change, of decarbonisation, but what I see as the collective action problem of climate change. So this is about addressing this persistent conundrum that, in spite of widespread recognition of the science of climate change, people recognise the seriousness of it. What we've not seen is any sustained or effective public demand for action. So why is that the case? Well, we know it's very complicated, that's why we're here, and from what we've heard this morning, we know it's very complicated. But what I'm specifically interested in is the role of media and communications in this process. How have they inhibited the development of a strong public sentiment and sense of priority on climate, and crucially, how might they promote it? So that's what I'm going to talk about, and please do forgive me if I talk an awful lot about the problems, as much as perhaps the solutions. I'm a sociologist, so that's really what we do, but I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to draw on a series of audience reception studies using focus groups, which I've done here in the UK. Obviously, I've done work elsewhere, but I'm going to focus on the UK work today. First of all, I just want to say a few words about the conceptual foundation for my work. That is that I see media and communications as part of a complex circuit in which power struggles take place. So they are both the product of social processes and reflective of power dynamics, but they are also productive in themselves with very real societal consequences. So to fully understand this, we need to look at first the cultural, the political, the production processes that shape content. This is about where the information comes from, the lobbying, as well as all of the things that journalists do day to day. We then have to look at, so that creates how content looks. We then have to look at the way in which audiences respond to content. And finally, we have to look at the implications of those responses for social action, both at the level of government policy and also at the level of what we do individually and collectively. So what I'm most interested in then is this moment where media and audience meet. How do existing beliefs, social experiences and the cultural information we're immersed in, how do they shape dispositions which are more likely to accept these arguments over here, or these series of arguments, and reject these other arguments? Thinking about it in the digital age, we also have to think about why do people comment, share, post on these messages, but not these ones? So, what do those choices say about people's immersion in particular online and offline communities? Also about the way they construct their identities, what they want to say about themselves, ultimately what's driving these processes of selection, of evaluation, of engagement. So looking at climate change specifically then, as I mentioned before, what my research finds this, but actually I think we see it day to day and we know it. So you get people say, oh, climate change, yeah, I know it's really serious. I read that it's the hottest year on record, but you know what, it's not really my thing. It's not really a problem I'm engaging with day to day. I know all that, but it's kind of someone else's problem. So why are audiences disengaging? So this is where my focus groups come in. Well, one of the reasons is that there's a real lack of clarity around the science. Now, that's perhaps not surprising because climate science is very complex. And in fact, across the years I've been doing this, I've seen a real improvement in this respect. That old confusion around the ozone layer don't really get that very much anymore. That's actually quite rare now. And if you ask participants in a survey, or if I ask participants in my focus groups as a top-line question, do you agree that human activity contributes or causes climate change, they'll mostly agree. But this is where focus groups, I think, are very illuminating on the very complex nature of understanding and belief, because we can look at the descriptive terms that people use. So when they start to talk about climate change, they'll say it's a controversy, it's a dispute, it's a debate, there's indecision, there's confusion. The background to this is that most people don't know the scientists are in agreement. I'm sure you all know that, but most people actually don't. And I think what my research shows that skepticism, as much as it is there, should really be thought of on a spectrum as opposed to a kind of fixed set of positions. So the denial, the outright denial position, that's very much marginalised here in the UK. In the US it's very, very different. I'm sure you'll say that people who know the US better than me will say that, and I've done some work there. In the US not so much, but in the UK it is marginalised. Even we see this when we watch Question Time. Nigel Lawson comes on, he gets booed and he gets hissed, he's on the margins of opinion, he still gets on the media, that's a different question. But in terms of public response, I'd say that's quite marginalised. But even amongst those people who profess a very strong belief in climate change, what you do get is this tendency to question the robustness of the data, to question the limits of scientific knowledge and what it can actually tell us. So in response to that question that I'm often asked, does the disproportionate time given to skeptics in our media construct a culture of denial, then no, it doesn't. But what it does do, and what it does very, very powerfully, is sow those seeds of doubt. Just sow those seeds of doubt, that nagging little voice at the back of the head that says, but they're not 100%. What if they're wrong? We've got all these other priorities. We've got immigration, we've got the economy. Should we focus on this? Do you know what? That can be someone else's problem. And as a participant said in my most recent study, everyone thinks it's someone else's problem. So in terms of the impact of the skeptics in our media, we're going to see an awful lot more of this. We've got Trump now. We're going to see an awful lot more of... I was thinking we'd be stopped talking about this, but I don't think we can. In terms of the impact that they've had, I did research in China and Brazil last year. They don't have skepticism in their media at all. It's a phenomenon of the English-speaking media. They do not have these doubts. They don't have these hesitations. Going back to my earlier point then about differing responses to content and how that connects with existing beliefs, the cultural and media environment in which people are immersed. My research again confirms something that we've been talking, or the media has been talking about, I think, a lot, particularly in the last couple of weeks. And this is this culture, or a crisis in public trust. I know you'll all know what I'm talking about, but what I feel, what I see, I think this is one of the biggest challenges we face, is this real and I see it in students all the time, obviously it's a big part of my job teaching students, this widespread ideology of cynicism about the information environment, about the journalists, about the media, about the range of speakers that we hear. So media bias, once upon a time, the preserve of people like me, academics, it's now the preserve of everyone. But the fact that media bias does exist doesn't preclude the very damaging impacts of having a default suspicion of everything that you're told, particularly so if it's a default suspicion of every single authoritative source. Now this is where people are at with this. Really, they will tell me this. And how do they work through it then? Well, again, in my focus groups, I ask about this. They give me all sorts of different techniques and strategies that they use to work their way through this very confusing media environment. This quote's fairly representative. I scare it all. I think newspapers, TV, news channels, I think they all have their own political agendas nowadays. It's up to you to work out which one is telling the truth. I couldn't trust them as far as I could throw them. They're in cahoots with the military, the government, etc., etc. That's on the cynical end, right? That's really on the cynical end, but not that unrepresentative. And I think a common strategy of people then is just to kind of draw on a whole range of resources to kind of strip away the ideologies, strip away the agendas. And I think there are two very interesting things here for me. The first is that in all this talk about the mainstream media being displaced by social media, well, it's not. I really find this time and time again. What is the interesting question to me is the way in which mainstream media is working with social media. So what happens is mainstream media sets the triggers, and that then leads to a kind of cycle of engagement on social media. This is proved by the research by the Reuters Institute at Oxford, done brilliant research on this. mainstream media is the lifeblood of social media. What then happens is they perhaps can't control the message. So Trump's a good example. Loads of mainstream coverage on Trump, all negative, and on social media, people rework that message. But they were talking about what the mainstream media were talking about. We might not agree with it, but they are setting the agenda. Climate change is not on the agenda of the mainstream media. There's no cycle of engagement on social media. I'm guessing you see it and I see it because we're in that world. But most people aren't talking about this. Most people are not talking about this on Facebook, talking about this on Reddit, talking about this on Twitter. The second thing I think that's interesting about this point, about the access to a whole range of information, is if you ask people, again, a top-line question, what do you think about this? Is it a good thing? They'll all say, oh yes, it's a wonderful thing, access to information, you know, I can see through the lies, I know it's all corrupt, I know that now, I didn't used to. And then you dig a little deeper. Dig a little deeper. People say the same thing. Now, they might be talking about that person over there who's not as educated as them, but they come to the same point. Actually, it's totally overwhelming. I don't know how to evaluate information. For every argument I hear a counter-argument. It's incredibly confusing. So again, a quote, I think it's because we're exposed to so many opinions from people, and you know, a lot of the times conflicting opinions, you don't know who to believe. It's a case of believing nothing instead of believing anything. And this is where I think social media comes in, because people tend to take sides on social media in an almost instinctive way. If you've dispensed with the arguments, the information, and you don't trust it, then just go with what feels right. And if the side you're taking, the groups you're aligning yourself with, are also reinforcing your ideas that everybody's lying and all the information sources and the politicians and all the rest of it are corrupt and we're not to trust them, then all the better. And this is where Trump and Farage come in, because they feed on that powerlessness. And I think the talk by Sally, who deconstructed the message of Trump, was very, very good in telling us that what he said was appealing. But one of the things I think that was very appealing was the fact that he said, I'm the only guy in the room who's going to tell you that they are all lying. I'm going to tell you that. Don't listen to them. Actually, it's quite a different message from saying, I'm the only guy in the room that's telling the truth. And it was incredibly powerful, I think. And of course, we know the background to this is that the level of trust in politicians right now is so low, right across the board in the Western world. We don't trust them. We feel democracy is dysfunctional. I think young people feel this incredibly strongly. And on climate change, if you can't trust the people making the decisions to lead in the public good on this, then who are you going to trust? So disengagement and powerlessness too. That's my message, I suppose, in terms of what the problem is. Quite negative, all of that. So yeah, I want to leave with some positives. How do we combat all of this then? Well, coming back to the point about messengers, building on the point I was making about scientists, actually, you know, even though there is this construction of dispute and division, and it's there, we have seen a real consolidation of the science in the public mind. That's why the denial position is marginalised. We have seen that. Again, if you ask people in surveys and in my work, who are the most trusted of all speakers, even in this horrible environment? Actually, the people who are doing the job on the ground, it's the scientists, it's the academics, it's the experts. So in this culture of distrust, there is still an element of trust for scientists. I really believe that there is. I'm not convinced by Gove's argument here. And I actually think that with all of the fallout of Brexit, we'll be returning to experts because we're really, really, really going to need them. Problem is, we're not hearing from scientists and experts quite often enough. So what could leadership originating and that expertise achieve in respect of powerlessness then? Well, I think a really interesting thing happened a few weeks ago, a month ago now, maybe it was. In the neoliberal context, we are so used to hearing decisions which are on the side of the corporations and not on the side of ordinary people. It just because we're completely immune to it because it always goes in that direction. It doesn't really ever go on the side of ordinary workers. And then in the context of all of this, we had this Uber ruling. Don't know if people were paying attention to this. Legal and employment experts won a victory in support of workers' rights. It was an incredibly powerful message. The government are doing nothing about this. But those experts got together, they used the structures, the legal structure in this case that they had, and they're forcing the government's hand on this, and I think that's a really important point. And I think the level of trust invested in scientists and academics gives them a great deal of public influence as well. Another good example, I feel that this is something we can really work with, is the divestment programme. So this is the programme that my university, other universities, the BMA have all signed up to. So this is, this really powerful message that these big, successful businesses, because trust me, my university is a business. I don't know if other people come from universities and don't feel that way, but I do. They are not going to profit from fossil fuels. And that's a really important message. This is not about bad PR for oil and gas. It's not. This is about bad PR for governments, letting them know that we are not accepting this now. And look at these big organisations, they're not accepting it too, and they're not accepting it before you're doing anything. So forcing governments to act, I think this collective action rooted in scientific expertise can be hugely powerful. Who might lead the legal expert case on the third runway at Heathrow? Who's going to take Trump on, starting already? I just have a few things left to say about media before I finish up on that point about, because obviously I do talk about media and communications, but how can we work with this media? We have to work with the media that we've got. I know there are some brilliant, brilliant journalists, but let's be honest, we have a neoliberal media not very sympathetic to this right now, and they follow politicians who are not talking about this right now. So we have to work with what we've got. I think one of the most significant shifts we've seen in recent years is the way in which journalism is driven by algorithms. I know you'll all probably think it's a really negative thing, and I do too, but we have to look at it as what it is. It's content being driven by algorithms. And what that means is if their audience spikes in an area of content, then they just deliver more of that content. So yes, it is Kim Kardashian. Yes, it is David Beckham. But the point is to get into that space, because however ideologically set, the mainstream media will respond to the bottom line. We need to get climate change on that agenda. We need to be reading about climate change. We need to be talking about it. We need to be, doing our Facebook posts. We need to be doing all of that because the mainstream media will respond. They respond because it sells papers, it sells broadcast advertising space. It's just the bottom line. That is it. We can work with wonderful journalists, but we need to look at the system as well and try to work within the system. The other point, my final point, is that, of course, we know politicians are obsessed with social media as well. I spoke to David Cameron's Director of PR and Communications last year. Oh my goodness, that's all he does all day. He looks at Periscope. Is it Periscope? I hadn't even heard of half of them. Instagram, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook. That is what they do. Now, we know it's a very distorted sense of what the public opinion is. There's a whole range of things that go on into what we see online. It's not necessarily directly how we feel about things. But the truth is they're looking at that and they're responding to that pressure. So loads of talk on immigration, that puts pressure on them because that's what people are talking about. That's how policy making in that area is going to go down. So we need to create that buzz on climate change. I'm not saying it's easy, but we need to kind of work within the system that we have. We need to create that buzz. We need to get people talking. Is it about, identifying those kind of lifestyle communities and identity politics? We might not like it. We might think it's been fragmentary in terms of action, but actually we need to tap into all of that. That's what politicians will respond to. So it's about bottom-up pressure in terms of mainstream journalism and also the politicians as well. So my final point is, I think bottom-up action, I think the power we have is more than we think we have. I think we feel very powerless right now. I think we should feel empowered to do something in the face of Trump, which is so terrifying to people. And I do hope we can try and find ways to be optimistic about what's happened.